Hello and welcome back to CM4D Basic Training. In this module we'll be considering some of the major ways that tables can be used as annotations within CM4D Classic to show and display data. So in previous modules we looked at a few other examples. For instance, we looked at text boxes, how those can be displayed, how to use system variables to resolve in order to display data that we want to see, whether it's, as we see here, the mean value of a particular dimension or a feature name. Different ways of displaying data can be combined using system variables to get the object to show information for whatever row or feature it's connected to. So we'll be doing similar things in showing table data. So first what we'll do is create a sheet and a data set that will be used to contain the information for the table. We could, of course, use any of the data sets available. Just in the example, I want to create data sets specifically for the table. So I'll go here to the Data Set tab and right-click on Data Sets and choose New Data Set. And here I will call this Table Data. And I'll make sure it's just looking at something properly here, maybe primary for surface and whole. If I go to data source, of course I can connect it to the query, and in this case I'll go to list and just choose maybe the first 20 points available, and that should be fine. And I can say all samples in query. And then I'll have a source for table data. And now what I'll do is go to Sheets and make a sheet to display the table annotations. So I can, again, right-click here on Main Set, choose New Sheet, and I will call this Table Annotations. So now I have a new sheet on which to display table information. So there's a few different ways that we can use tables. The first way is very simple. If we click here on Table, the icon at the top in this list, I'll see that my cursor has changed to a table icon. If I click on the white space, it will draw a table on the white space for me. And in this instance, I can simply connect this table to a source of data, being the table data set. So again, I'll right click, go to Properties, go to Data Source, click on Data Set, and I can choose Table Data. And if I want everything to display, I could say Use All Rows, and it will simply make a table that will reflect the contents of my table data set. So that's a very quick way of displaying information. If you notice, it has default rows and column headers. The row headers being the feature names, column headers being the sample labels. Those can be turned on and off. Also, if you notice, some of the columns might need to be a little longer if we wanted to keep that display. We can change the row and column length and width. So if I right click and go to Edit, I can click on the table and I can adjust the widths of individual columns if I want to, like so. You could also adjust the widths of individual columns here as well by clicking and expanding that particular row or particular column. If I wanted everything to be even while I'm in edit mode, I can click here while the row and column headers are turned on in this upper corner. If I click and then right click, I have the option set row height, set column width. So for the row height, it'll be a particular number, which is based off of how the software has divided up the grid for the white space. I can have it 5 points high for the row height. That will set everything to the same row height. If I right click and say set column width, I could set that as well. Let's say if I do 30, it would expand everything to be a width of 30, or I could make it smaller, like 15, and do so, or simply click on the table, make it slightly bigger, and then make the individual columns bigger as well. So if I wanted to change whether I see row and column headers at all, there's an option to do that if I right click and go to properties. There's a few options here for the first tab, which is the table tab. There is a setup option which lets me adjust properties for the table, such as the number of rows and columns. This is usually set before data is being displayed. When the table is connected to a source of data, this will automatically update based off of the settings you selected. But down below here, there's options for displaying row headers and column headers. I can turn those on or off, and that will get rid of those row and column headers at the top and side if I just want the data to be shown from the data set. So that's one way of displaying data. It's very quick. Another way of displaying data is if I use a certain option. If I go back to properties and go to show data set setup, I can go here and turn on show table as data set, and this gives me some options as to what gets displayed in the rows and column headers, or to add additional row and column headers. So for instance, I have here column header, show as label, a feature or sample. Same for the row header. If I go here to column footers, I can also display other types of data, such as the sum of the entire column, count of event conformers or non-conformers, or percentage of event conformers and non-conformers. These values here are based off of the event settings that we've set up in the data set. So for instance, if I go back to here and say count of event conformers, it's added a count down here at the bottom of 20, and there's 20 rows here, but the event is set up here in the data set. If I right click and go to properties and go to event, here I can specify again what a logic condition would be compared against all of the values in this data set. So if I, for instance, if I choose value greater than or equal to 0, this means that every value in the data set will be checked to see if it's greater than or equal to 0. And if it is, that would be considered a non-conforming event. So any value that's less than 0 would be considered a conforming event. So doing something like that, it's now counting how many values are less than 0 and displaying that number here at the bottom of each column. So if I wanted to do the opposite, count of non-conformers, it would give me the count of all the values that are greater or equal to 0. So that's one simple way of illustrating how we can use the addition of these different column footers or row footers to display some summary data that's relevant to the table itself. So this is another method that we can use. And then also there's some summary table information we can display for these corner cells, like upper left cell, the lower right cell. If we wanted to display count of event conformers, it would do that for the entire data set, which is seen here. So that's another way that we can show information, is to use these additional table properties options. Now, of course, with these different ways, we can always change the styling of the table itself. So here we have style, and then we have cell style. So this style is for the general table, where we can change maybe the coloring of the table itself. So I just created a red pen border around the entire table, but it doesn't affect the cells themselves because there's a separate area for cell style where that can be changed as well. So I can go here to setup. If I change the pen for the cell style, let's say that I want blue as, or light blue as the cell style there. And then the font, I could change the size of that as well for all these individual cells. Same options as what we saw for the text boxes would apply here, but for the individual cells. So that's how we can change some of the styling for the table cells and the table itself. Okay, so one last way that tables can be used outside of just connecting to a source of data and displaying the content is to display summary statistics or calculated values. So for instance, we have this table here. If I wanted to, I can make another table by clicking on New Table, clicking here to create a new one. And in order to display calculated values, we can modify the cells themselves. So if we go here to Properties, I have here a list of cells, and before I connect this to a data source, what I can do is modify or put in exactly what I want the cells to display. So let's say that for the data above, I want to see summary information. And what I can do is create my own header for this row, and I can have have this say feature, maybe have this be the dimension. One column could be range, and if I run out of columns, I can right click and choose add column. Maybe this could be CPK. And maybe some other statistic like standard deviation, CP, PP, PPK, average. In fact, I can do this. Call that the mean value or average value, and this can be CPK. So this would serve as a column header. And here, I would actually put the variables that I needed to display this information. So for feature, the variable would be feature comma label with 2 tildes between it. The dimension would be the type of data being displayed. The variable for resolving that would be tilde CHR tilde. For range, it's tilde range tilde. The mean or average would be tilde mean tilde. And CPK tilde CPK tilde. So if I want to display that information, if I hit OK, you'll see that it gives me the wording that I put in for the first row, but the variables don't resolve yet because this isn't connected. But if I'm typing in what I want for my column headers, I don't need the ones that come by default. So again, I can right click and go to Properties, Setup, and turn off the row and column headers. So if I do that and then go to Properties, I can connect here with data source to the table data source or table data set. And again, I can say use all rows. And then I have the variables resolving. But if you notice, it only resolves for the first row. It doesn't expand. So when we use variables for a row, we have to tell the table or the individual cell how we want it to expand in order to show the rest of the information. So to make that adjustment, I'm going to zoom in by clicking on the table, clicking here on Zoom Selected, and then using my mouse wheel to zoom out just a little bit. Again, I can go to Edit and make this first column a little bigger by dragging. And then if I want to get these cells to expand, I would go to Edit. I would click on the particular cell, in this case just the bottom one. Right click, and then I have some other options. Cell properties, set row height, and column width. So in this case I would choose cell properties. Here for cell properties, if I wanted to, I could replace or modify the variable for that particular cell. With individual cells, you can also connect to different sources of data. By default, this cell will be looking at the same data set that the entire table is looking at. But there are instances where you could turn this off and have the cell connect to a completely different data set or source of data. That's for more advanced options when it comes to tables. If you need one table to show data from different data sets combined together, if the information is synchronized, then you could possibly do an operation like that. But for now, we'll use the default option to use table data source. And then here, where it says automatic expansion, this is where we tell the cell how we want it to expand to view the rest of the rows that the table is looking at. So we have two options, expand by feature and expand by sample, or both. What we want to do is basically expand by the feature name. So in the data set, each row is for a particular feature, and then it has columns going from left to right to show the sample data. So we want the table or this cell to expand downward based on the features on each row. So we'll select feature, and then here it says samples across features down, features across samples down. We want the table to expand with features going down. So this is the option, samples across, features down. So it's going to expand by feature, and the features are going to expand down. So if we do that, and then hit OK, and then exit, you'll notice that the table has expanded downward for the other cells or the other rows in this table data set. But the other columns have not. So that means we have to do the same operation for these other four cells. So if I go back to edit, I go here to the next cell, right click cell properties, choose feature and features down, and do the same for these last cells. And once we do that, it will calculate the statistics that we told it with the variables, or display the information that we wanted it to for each of the rows in this data set, using the data on each row to calculate these values. So this is most advanced way of using a table, but it will allow you to specify exactly what it is you'd like to see. So these are two different methods. If, for instance, a customer wants to see maybe some nominal data or calculated values at the end of a table, they could do something like this, and then have another table that's just looking at the actual values of a data set, and basically put the two near each other, maybe do some resizing in order to make everything line up. Perhaps resize the row heights for the two tables. Use the grid lines here. If we turn this on, we can have these click in place. And line up the tables to show the data. So there's some alignment tools that will be shown in another module that will make things easier when it comes to lining objects up, getting them on the same edge. For instance, I could highlight both of these, go to align bottom to make sure they share the same bottom edge, and then of course I would look at the properties for the row height for both and set them to be the same. That way it would come across as one table instead of two separate tables. So one other thing to show is how do we limit data in a table? Well, in both of these cases, we can have the table look at a subset of whatever data it's connected to. For instance, both tables right now are looking at this data set, which has 20 rows. If I want, I can have this table by going to data source, maybe look at the first 10 rows by saying, look at row 1 through 10. And I can do the same for the table below. Have this also look at row 1 through 10, and it will limit how the table expands. If we do that, we could always hold control and drag this table, and then the next set of points will automatically increment to whatever range the first table is set. So the first table is set to look at rows 1 through 10. This is now looking at rows 11 through 20. And the same, of course, could be done with the table above. One thing to note, though, is when you are looking at data where you have a number of columns to represent the different samples that are contained within the data set, we could limit the columns as well as the rows for this use of the table. So I can go to Properties, go to Data Source, and right now it's looking at row 1 through 10, but we can also, by selecting this option down below where it says Sample, maybe have it look at row 1 through 5, or I'm sorry, column 1 through 5, or maybe 5 through 10 to view the first 5 or the last 5 samples that are in this data set, and therefore crop or limit the number of rows and columns that the table is looking at. So those are just some of the most common ways that tables can be created and used. Of course, there can be complex ways to synchronize data between data sets and combine information from multiple tables into one display on the page. But in general, the options that we've gone over cover the majority of how tables would be used to create and show content in a grid structure. So with that, we will end this module. Thank you for watching, and we will move on to the next module of basic training.